It's wonderful to welcome so many folks from so many different places to our discussion today on race and remembrance in contemporary Europe with Professors Ana Lucia Araujo and Mam Fatou Niang. My name is Mary Lewis, and I teach the history of France and its empire here at Harvard. I'm joining you from my attic, but the photo behind me is of a museum in Pointe-à-Pitre, Guadeloupe, called Memorial Act, which is a museum devoted to the history and collective memory of the slave trade and slavery. Today's event is part of a two-part series. Next semester, we will host an event called Race and Representation, which will touch on the question of political representation in Europe in terms of how it relates to questions of race. Stay tuned for updates about that event. Before we start, I want to thank all the people who made this event possible. The idea for this event began as a conversation with Gila Naderi and Maya Jasanoff in the spring following George Floyd's murder. The director of the Center for European Studies, Grzegorz Ekiert, agreed to sponsor this event as a director's seminar, for which we thank him. Thanks are also due to the executive director, Elaine Papoulias, and all the staff, including especially Gila Naderi, Vasilis Koutafaris, and Michael Berrio, who have dealt with all the logistics and the technological aspects. We'd also like to thank the Cultural Services of the French Embassy in the United States for the funding associated with this event, and Harvard for its Zoom space. Finally, of course, our distinguished speakers. I will introduce both of them, and then each will talk briefly about monuments and memorialization in Europe. Then I'll ask a follow-up question, and finally we'll open it to your questions, which I ask you to pose at any time via the Q&A. Ana Lucia Araujo is professor at the historically Black Howard University in Washington, D.C. Her recent single-authored books include Slavery in the Age of Memory, Engaging the Past, which just came out from Bloomsbury Academic this last week. Congratulations, Ana. She has also published Reparations for Slavery and the Slave Trade, a transnational and comparative history with Bloomsburg 3 years ago, and Brazil Through French Eyes, a 19th century artist in the tropics in 2015. She is a member of the International Scientific Committee of the UNESCO Slave Route Project. Currently, she's working on 2 book projects, both already under contract, and she also just finished an additional short format book called Museums and Atlantic Slavery, to be published in 2021 by Routledge in their series Routledge Museums in Focus. Mam Fatou Niang is Associate Professor of French and Francophone Studies at Carnegie Mellon University. Her recent research examines the development of Afro-French identities and the works of female writers of the banlieue or suburbs. She is the author of Identité Française from Brill in 2019. Her work has been featured in academic journals and edited volumes, including Contemporary French Civilization, Présence francophone, and Racisme de France, which was just published earlier this month by La Découverte. Professor Niang is also a photographer and the co-author of a photo series on Black French Islam. In 2015, she co-directed Marianne Noir, Mosaïque Afropéenne, a film in which 7 Afro-French women investigate the pieces of their mosaic identities and unravel what it means to be Black and French and Black in France. Welcome, and thank you to both of you.
Thank you, Mary.
I thought we'd start with the various monument removals over the summer, both spontaneous and planned, and engage in a discussion of how slavery was remembered in different places. I mean, in thinking about this question, I couldn't help but think about the Haitian anthropologist Michel Roth-Triot's Silencing the Past and his argument that silencing is an active process. And since the silencing that Triot is talking about is produced by ontological framings that are quite resistant to change, I wonder if we could see some of the activism that we saw over the summer, or that Black Lives Matter put in Robert Milligan's statue hand in the slideshow you just saw, as a kind of effort to disrupt those ontologies. We'll turn first to Professor Araujo.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary, for inviting me for this panel. And I'm very glad to be here with Mam Fatou as well. Then in Europe, Africa, and the Americas, then in the last years, you can say that, and especially, of course, in the last few months, demonstrators, they took down monuments honoring enslaved merchants and white men who owned enslaved people and also who promoted pro-slavery and pro-colonial ideas. Then following this trend, we can say that municipalities also decided to remove particular monuments. In England, for example, the City of London ordered the removal of Robert Milligan's monument that was across from the Museum of London Docklands, and this monument was there since the early 19th century. These, however, were not really new events or isolated trends. We know that crowds, they took down monuments during the American Revolutionary War, during the French Revolution, during the July Revolution of 1830 in France as well. With the end of the Cold War, also in the fall of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, we also had citizens of several countries that called for the removal of monuments that paid homage to communist leaders. Then in countries like Portugal, like Spain, France, the Netherlands, and England, we also saw that all countries that actively participated in the Atlantic slave trade, and then later invaded, conquered, and colonized African countries, we also saw then similar situations. Then, although the history of their participation in these atrocities is very well documented by historians, then and also has been, I would say, object of extensive scholarship, the public memory of these atrocities. And here I refer to public memory as the way that groups and citizens, they engage with this painful past in the public arena and the public space. Then the public memory of slavery in these countries remained, I would say, a battlefield, a contested battlefield. Now, debates associated with the slave trading past and the slave owning past and the colonial past of these countries are totally connected from the ways that white supremacy and racism operate in the societies with their particular ways. And of course, with the ways that historically the existence of white supremacy and racism has been denied. Then in all these countries, the public spaces are populated and by statues that pay homage to slave owners and slave merchants as well. Also heritage sites that are associated with the Atlantic slave trade, and also buildings and other ventures that are named after these men who made great profits from the Atlantic slave trade. Now, until the 1990s, none of these markers included any acknowledgement to the involvement of these men in these atrocities. In this context, then what you can say is that a context where the past of slavery and colonialism was made invisible. The descendants of enslaved Africans and also the descendants of Black citizens whose origins are in some ways associated with the colonial rule of these European countries in the Caribbean and in Africa, they joined in many ways forces and started not only challenging these silences, but also denouncing the intrinsic racism, for example, that French and British or Portuguese societies then promote. And here, of course, we saw then similar developments in other European countries, and I would say especially in Portugal and the Netherlands. Now, the battles then of the public memory of the slavery were associated with the the battles of the public memory of colonialism. Then in Britain and France, for example, especially then the former slave trade ports like Bristol, Liverpool, and also London, which was also a slave port, and then Bordeaux or Nantes in France. And then we have also Paris, which was not a slave port, but was a site for these protests. In all these places, Black citizens, they protested police violence and the deep racism then that maintained them excluded from British and French societies. Then many citizens, despite them being born in England and France, they have been referred to, and sometimes even by scholars, as immigrants and other terms labeling them as foreigners. Then the rise of these battles included, of course, demonstrations. You are going to have activists demanding European nations then to recognize their participation in the Atlantic slave trade. And by the way, several then of these protests emerged already in the 1980s, but they became more prominent, we can say, in the 1990s, coinciding usually with moments of commemoration. For example, then the abolition, the sesquicentennial of the abolition of slavery, of the second abolition of slavery in France in 1998, and then 2007, which was the bicentennial of the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade in Britain. And in many of these cases, the citizens, they have contested the fact that these commemorations indeed did not at all emphasize the role of enslaved people themselves in the fight against slavery. For example, Asian Revolution was totally erased from these commemorations of 1998 in France. In 2007 in Britain, what we saw also, it was that the most of the focus was then the idea of the emphasizing then the role of the abolitionists, the British abolitionists, such as William Wilberforce and so. Now, either then in Britain, in France, and later in the Netherlands, and more recently now in Portugal as well, we're going to see Black residents, Black citizens, sometimes with the support of academics, who demanded several times organized actions demanding to contextualize these pro-slavery and pro-colonial monuments. They also demanded the construction of monuments honoring enslaved people and people who fought against then the colonial rule in Africa. And all these demands remain unheard until this summer, June 2020, when the citizens here in the United States, where they were already in action, and then in other parts of Europe, including then Portugal, France, and England, they took the matter into their own hands and decided then to take down these monuments. Then, until then, they were not heard, but now they are acting on their own behalf.
Thank you so much, Shauna. I'm now in a different memorial. This one is a memorial to abolition in Nantes, France. And it was interesting what you were just saying about how memorials to abolition often focused on metropolitans rather than on necessarily on the contribution that enslaved people made to abolition. I'm struck by how the one memorial in metropolitan France is a memorial to abolition, whereas the one I was just in Guadeloupe was to the collective memory of slavery and the slave trade. Which is perhaps a function of how these institutions are made. And that brings me to Dr. Young. Is the construction of memory in France, like so many other things, just more state-driven than maybe we see elsewhere? I'm thinking of things like the official pantheonization of Republican heroes and so forth. How do the practices of memorializing in France work, particularly when it comes to an uncomfortable past regarding race?
Wow, thank you so much, Mary, for the invitation. And I'm super happy to, have the opportunity to be in this space with you. So I just wanted to start by talking about what's happening now. So last Friday, Samuel Paty, a history teacher, was beheaded in the street by an 18-year-old Chechen refugee for showing caricatures of the naked Prophet Muhammad to sixth graders. And amid nationwide rallies to honor the teacher and defend the Republic and its values, such as freedom of expression, pundits and politicians have been condemning what they called déboulonneurs de République. And I don't think that the term is used randomly. The word déboulonner, to topple, made a dashing entry into the French public sphere during the global movement that followed George Floyd's death this past May, and a movement that in France seriously shook the Republican narrative. On Friday, I received a video of a beheading with these words: "You try to guillotine France with your racist activities. Are you happy now that one of your colleagues has been decapitated by your Islamist friends?" I reported the tweet and put my account on private, but this message and the intense backlash, both by the states and in the population, is indicative of the intense the backlash, not only against fundamentalists and Muslims in France, but really against anybody perceived as posing a threat to the Republic. It is a cruel reminder of how precarious our standing and our gains are. Less than a week ago, I'm having conversation with Rokeya Jallo Mabula, and we felt that we were still riding an unprecedented wave, and Anna referred to that, this what I call a gush out of the broken Republican dam, that barrier that often contain works on race and memory in France. And since Friday, the general feeling here is that this 2020 momentum is in jeopardy, not just the momentum from this summer, but the result of several years, decades of engagement, as now any voices that interrogate the Republic's past or present action is accused of being a collabo, of being in bed with terrorists to topple France. So this is where we are, almost overnight. And to come back to your question, right now it looks like any like memorialization or any education on race and memory, especially around questions of race and slavery, is happening in real time and everywhere, but in textbooks or in institutional settings. That poses multiple challenges due to the top-down and more static nature of knowledge production in France and the kind of dogma on who is an authorized, credible producer of knowledge in France. The difficulties are also due in great part to the entrenched refusal to consider race as a valid category of analysis, and just the general unwillingness here to go against Renan's recommendation when he said that the nation was built as much on what we collectively forget as on what we wish to remember. And in that sense, the current attempt at unveiling what is considered unpleasant memory is severely frowned upon, but that does not stop this new generation of social actors from sorting out our post-colonial mythologies. I will use two examples to illustrate current attitudes around race and commemoration: the Assemblée Nationale fresco that you've seen at the beginning of this talk, and the statue of Joséphine de Beauharnais in Fort-de-France, Martinique. So the Assemblée Nationale piece commemorates the first time France abolished slavery in 1794. And my colleague Julien Ciodo and I unleashed what I call a beast in a beret when we called it a moral fault whose presence on the walls of the Assemblée Nationale must question the flaws of our education system and of our collective memory. We were told that we were racist, we were ignorant, incapable of seeing that the piece was a fun attempt at caricature, a piece of irony in the purest French tradition. We were called ayatollahs, issuing fatwas against the artist, a white artist, Hervé de Rosa, and citing Voltaire, Charlie Hebdo, the sacredness of art, the sacredness of freedom of expression. Our detractors argued that this fresco was art, and as such, it was free to shock. Then we were repeatedly told, we repeatedly heard that, and I quote here, people never learned in school that these signs were harmful. We never learned in our public space that these signs were harmful. And that last part to me was the most puzzling. The general apathy in France around the fresco, as people were largely unwilling, unable to read it as offending and blatantly racist. And that to me spoke volumes about the flaws or the success of our Republican ecosystem in erasing these signs from our collective memory. I got into interesting and sometimes hated arguments with scholars and militants, oftentimes younger than me, right? And who told me that the time for civil dialogue, civil exchange was up, that the maddening debate, the absolute maddening debate around the fresco was a sign, if we needed one, that France will never admit on its own that some of its heroes were our persecutors, that the way we memorialize part of our history was problematic. And I think this is also where we see the differences in terms of methods and generational influence. People, younger people, taking matters into their own hands because they felt like we've exhausted all civil or official avenues. And that brings me to my second example, which is the toppling of Empress Josephine's statue in Martinique this past July. So the statue was erected at the center of Parc de la Savane in Fort-de-France in 1856. And it was later relegated to a corner of the park in 74. By then Mayor, 1974, by then Mayor Aimé Césaire. In 91, it was beheaded. And this past July, on the 26th, the statue was brought down and set on fire by a group of militants. The fate of the Assemblée Nationale fresco and the statue of Joséphine complicate, in my opinion, ideas that we have currently around the lieu de mémoire and commemoration or decommemoration. I'm going to play devil's advocate here, but in both cases, I think that the community's interest lie in the conservation of these artifacts rather than in their destruction. The Headless, I've been to Fort-de-France many times, and in my opinion, the Headless statue of Joséphine was an extremely powerful vision, an extremely powerful symbol during protests against the use of chlordecone or protests against skyrocketing cost of living, after a strike or at the end of a soccer game, people would express themselves on the statue. And here I use the word express, not deface, right? And the statue became a receptacle, a page on which was inscribed stories of the city, stories that were readable on its red stains, its tag, and that missing head. And when we think of statues and monuments, we think not only of what they represent in the present, but we must not forget what they meant at the time of their installation, what message they were supposed to convey to those who would walk past them. And in my opinion, 2020 Josephine carried narrative that its mid-19th century creators would have never imagined. In a sense, it was cannibalized. It's like the statue was cannibalized by the residents of Fort-de-France to follow on the aesthetic of urban cannibalism promoted by Suzanne Russy and Césaire. It's also my position regarding the fresco. Its presence at the Assemblée Nationale is a daily insult, but the work should not be destroyed. It'd be better moved to something like Memento Park in Hungary, a place where it will testify of its creation, why, how it was created, how it was able to hang at the Assemblée Nationale for almost 30 years without an itch, and testify to the subsequent fury that was unleashed when we pointed at it. And just to finish, of course, the question now is, who should decide on what is to say, what needs to go, what needs to be transformed, contextualized, created, where, how, by who? And this process calls for what they call a démocratisation de la mémoire, democratization of memory making that France is not ready to undertake, since for some, and our president is one, redress implies culpability. And as Macron solemnly declared, he said that the Republic will not erase any trace or any name from its history. It will not take down any statue. So I'll keep buying my bread at the bakery Rue du Jour. I'll send my kids to École Colbert. I will have to travel all the way to Pointe-à-Pitre, as you mentioned, Mary, to visit a decent French memorial on the slave trade and slavery, and l'histoire is to be continued.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think your remarks, Mom, have pointed toward my third and final question before we open up the Q&A, and that is, the role of activism in constructing public memory or in contesting the way that institutions have framed public memory. So I thought we could maybe briefly, and as briefly as possible, discuss differences in activism in the UK, France, maybe Portugal, any countries that you want to bring into the mix. We'll start with Anna.
Okay, then I would just bring again the fact that we cannot discuss any of these issues regarding the monuments dissociated from the problem of how these societies implement their views of white supremacy and racism. And then activists in the two countries, and at the end I will talk a little bit about Portugal, then either in France and England, they took advantage especially of commemorative dates then regarding abolition in particular, in order to develop and advance their agendas. In France, these groups, they were much more organized than through associations. In England, the presence of these associations is not very important. It's not like in France, but we had also more or less formal groups organized. And in both cases, then in the two capitals, London and Paris, but also in the former slave trading ports, where usually the population of African descent is about between 3% and sometimes perhaps 8% of the local populations. And let's take the example, for example, of Bristol, the place where that statue of Edward Colston that was there since the end of the 19th century was then toppled by demonstrators organized more or less around Black Lives Matter activists. And that is one example that goes then in symphony with what Mam Fatou just mentioned. There is this idea that there were interventions in that statue several times. Then we had already movements then countering Colston going on in Bristol for several years. Since the 1990s, indeed, Black activists, even along academics, they put in place initiatives in the city to highlight the city's slave past. Then this sort of activism in the case of Bristol included, for example, activists and academics creating these heritage trails that were intended to highlight the spots that were associated with slave trading activities. And they were successful in getting some results. Let's say in the 1990s, for example, there was a plaque that was inaugurated at the end of the 1990s at the harbor, then acknowledging the role of Bristol as a slave trading port. There is a bridge in the harbor that was named after Pero Jones, that was an enslaved man owned by one of the wealthy slave merchants in the city that was called Penny, John Penny. And also in his house, the house of John Penny, that was an 18th century then mentioned, let's say that way, that today is a museum, the Georgian House Museum. That house included an exhibition then about the enslaved people owned by Penny. Then we had these different initiatives in the 1990s. And of course, that the big change in all this situation was also related to the commemoration of the bicentennial in 2007. And I would say that the most important achievement, despite the fact that there were several exhibitions everywhere, conferences, books, and so on, the most important achievement was the creation of the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, that was then the largest British slave port. And that museum is a museum that is not very big if you compare to the present day gallery, just the gallery, the Slavery and Freedom Gallery at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, that focuses on slavery. Today, then, the International Slavery Museum is not very big, but it was an important step because it was a museum that was created from the initiative deriving from the demands of activists. They created a large process of consulting Black communities locally in Liverpool and so on. And that museum is considered as a museum, an activist museum. It's a museum that hired Black curators and so on. It's a museum also that the director is involved in the commemoration activities and a series of activities, especially commemoration in August, that is the International Day of Remembrance of Slavery. Now in France, Mme Fatou is going to speak a little bit more, but I believe that the difference is that we have much more formal associations that are created, but the timeline coincides much with what happened in Britain, especially then these commemorations in 1998. Already from that period, you are going to see a number of associations that emerged. We have shackles of memory, that is Anneau de la Mémoire, that is an association that was created, then gathering Black activists and also white professionals and so on. This was created then in the early 1990s, and they were very successful in putting in place for the first time an exhibition telling the story of the slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. And from there, 3 other associations were created as well. Then in other parts of France, especially in Paris, then the Committee of May 23rd, 1998, CM 98, the Committee of the Daughters and Sons of Deported Africans, and also we have the collective of DOM. Then there is an association that then gathers then French citizens of overseas departments. And these associations, they organized marches and important demonstrations during this period. And of course, all these ended up to having some kind of impact, then official impact, with the creation of national days, the National Day commemorating then the abolition of slavery, that is commemorated on May 10th, and this derives from the passing of the Taubira law in 2001. We had, of course, in Bordeaux and Nantes, then this monument, this memorial that Mary is displaying behind her when she's speaking. This is a memorial that was unveiled recently in the years 2000, but Nantes has already a National History Museum that has an important exhibition telling the history of the city's involvement with slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. Now Bordeaux also has Musée d'Aquitaine, a very important exhibition with its flaws that I talk about in my book, but the exhibition is there. Then there is a public recognition. And more recently, what I think that is interesting in this particular case of Bordeaux is that there was all this debate about changing the names of the streets. We had this debate in Liverpool. In Liverpool, it ended up that the names were not changed, and the streets that were named after slave merchants. In Bordeaux, we had a similar debate, but the city created a commission, and the commission decided to not change the names of the streets. But last year it was last year, they inaugurated a new plaques with the names of the streets, but these are very big plaques that have a very long paragraph telling the involvement of this man with the Atlantic slave trade. Also, they unveiled a big monument honoring an enslaved woman that is called Marthe Adélaïde Modeste Testas. Then this activism indeed, we had demonstrations, but you also have a memory activism that we can say that was pretty much effective.
Okay, Mom, do you have anything that you would like to add to that?
I mean,
keeping in mind that we also want to get to the numerous questions.
Absolutely. I mean, Anna for France, Anna did an amazing question for memorialization. So I'm just going to keep it on the involvement of activists and local actors in public memory debates, and how different kind of activism and different relationship of activists affect the terrain of remembering race. And in France, the anti-racist camp is broadly divided into 2 opposing groups whose visions differ on almost everything, even on the existence of racism in France. We can get maybe into that in the Q&A. The first camp is that of what we call the historic universalist or Republican anti-racist organization. These were often government-funded or government-backed associations such as SOS Racisme or La LICRA. And the second group, and which I think is the most interesting, is a motley crew of young scholars, activists, artists with solid roots in working class neighborhoods, many of them being themselves children of France's colonial past and backed by scholars, mostly white scholars, white French scholars. And I use the term anti-racism 2.0 for this group in my book because they are very much a product of a social media culture with rhizomatic connections with Black diasporas and their modes of action, from Bristol to Charlottesville, from Johannesburg to Dakar. And in France, this group is highly vilified with adjectives such as racist, racialist, indigenous, and separatist being thrown at its member. The main criticism that members of this group had against more institutionalized anti-racist organization was that these groups like LICRA, SOS Racisme, essentialized memory and kind of museified it, right? Museified the terrain of remembering race by keeping the actions at highly symbolic, rhetoric level, commemoration of le 22 mai, le 23 mai, etc., and not really actively linking the past to current situations of discrimination and the need to combat them. And that link, that genealogy between past and present, the desire to propose concrete and immediate action is apparent in the work of and what I call the anti-racist 2.0 movement, such as Moissy, les activistes Hervé, Noir Rouge Vert in Martinique, La Vérité pour Adama, Brigade anti-négrophonie, Anneau de la Mémoire, Comité de mai 98, the Comité des Enfants de Liberté, but also in several, and this was what I thought that I found really interesting in some of my research, several Antillian associations, those Caribbean associations that we used to call the Balaboudins, right? That are actually doing very important work in the production of memory and the conservation of memory on slavery from Dunkirk to Paris and Bordeaux. And this is also apparent in my work and public scholarship, but also in the production of colleagues such as Audrey Célestine, Maboula, Sylviane Larcher, Nabou Fofana. Our work, and I'm going to go really fast with this, our work revolves around multiple questions. How do we educate people on memory in a country where the construction of memory is a private turf, the chasse gardée, the exclusive domain of the state? How do we work on race in a country where race is told to not exist, right? How can we use memory and remembrance to fuel social and political action on issues as diverse as police violence, environmental issue, racial inequality and access to education, employment, housing, healthcare service, so on and so forth? How do we question the visible, right? The street names, the statues of Colbert, Belin de Nambuc, but also what do we do with the voids, the missing pages? What do we do with the fact that in the 10th grade, a French kid will analyze, study in great length the slave trade in Brazil, in the Americas, in the Portuguese islands, but only covers abolition when it comes to French territories? And so really the question for us is, what do we do with these silences and the way they have forged our national consciousness on race, slavery as being, a foreign institution, an American institution. And our environment remains desperately mum about race in the French context, about the French figures of Black emancipation who will never be, who are yet to be immortalized, by a station or a high school, the way Rosa Parks had been, or Martin Luther King, or even Marielle Franco very recently. And here, the recent treatment of the George Floyd affair is emblematic of this tendency to denounce the effect of racial categorization in Minneapolis, in Sao Paulo, in Johannesburg, but to go MIA when it comes to similar situation in Paris, Pointe-à-Pitre, or Lyon. And the push that's happening right now for this national stroll down our collective memory line is also an effort from us to highlight the fact that these elements are not just part of Black French history, they're an integral part of the history of France. And just to finish, through bodies like mine, France is forced to face its coloniality, to face its history, forced to reopen pages that were long sealed. And in order to think about our future, we have to talk about Haiti. We will have to talk about Toussaint. We have to explain why France ratified 2 abolitions. We have to talk about the colonies. We have to talk about these young Black men and brown men who were called from the 4 corners of the empire to participate in wars and rebuild a battered country. We have to unveil these individual histories and talk about their links to the, this bigger roman national. We have to tell the stories of these men behind the, the Renault and the Citroën lineup assembly lines. We have to talk about this 13-year-old Black girl visiting the Assemblée Nationale with her class, about her pain, about her humiliation, as her classmates scoff at these two grotesque figures that are supposed to commemorate the abolition of slavery. And what we are undertaking, following, the examples of brothers, from Bristol to DC, is neither cancel culture, as it's been widely told, nor a vengeful quest for repentance. These actions are fueled by the realization that France can no longer hide behind a pseudo-universalism that refuses to live in the present. And in my opinion, this, what I call in my book, this democratization of the universal, is without a doubt one of the greatest projects of our times.
Thank you so much for that. You already started to answer a number of the questions in the chat, perhaps inadvertently. And what I'm going to try to do, because there are already 10 of them, is to try and characterize the general gist of the way they're going, and maybe both of you can weigh in. So there's one kind of thread of questions that has to do with what you do instead of having these monuments. Is a plaque enough? What kind of memento parks can we, in the plural, can we have? One, Janelle Sherman mentions, for instance, the Assemblée Nationale metro station, and how we can maybe create more of these spaces. And then there's a kind of almost opposite thrust, which is like, can we really even have, is it a plaque or these kinds of counter memorializations enough in a context of white supremacy? I mean, is this really possible? And sort of along those lines too, in one, a person asks, Patricia Marcos asks, if we can see these contestations as a kind of reparation or restitution. So they're moving in lots of different directions, but they're all coming around the question of, what should be done short of, leaving these statues intact simply the way they are, or completely demolishing them. And so both of you have already started to address that, but if you could just maybe respond to the specific ways in which these questions are going, that would be great. And then I will come back to a couple other groupings.
Perhaps Mom can go first. I already spoke too long the second time. Go ahead.
Come on, no. So this is an interesting question, what, where, how, by who, right? And when we think, when thinking about these efforts to expand and rethink notions of collective memory, and in our case, notions of French collective memory, I'm going back to what Etienne Hachi, Lydie Modileno, and Charles Forstick said in the introduction of Postcolonial Realms of Memory, when they wrote that the need to make visible the invisible thread that links the colonial to French culture. And I'm reading it and I'm thinking, well, I embody that link. My Black female body racializes and genderizes the refusal to acknowledge that link between past and present, right? And in my opinion, the refusal to acknowledge my body, the refusal to acknowledge that link between past and present is an erasure of my body. And that erasure, that silencing, to go back to you referenced through you at the beginning of your talk, and the ultimate silencing is death. And that erasure, that silencing, sometimes go beyond the symbolic in France, and it translates into the definite erasure, the death of Black and brown bodies, victim of law enforcement practices that are themselves informed by practices born from coloniality. So when I just see this as a, as a cycle, right, of threads feeding into one another. And what we need, at least in France, and this is when I talk about the democratization of memory, is to try to get as many people as possible around the table. And this is where the conversation is not happening in France, to contrary to what's to our neighbor. How do we choose? I mean, are we going for the material? Are we going for the immaterial? How do we discuss the postcolonial realms of memory? And it's exciting. I mean, that at least we're the conversation is starting. But again, with the recent event, it's just showing how, I talk about the fragility of this situation and how quick some of the gains that we thought that we had, and and you're building this brick by brick, and how quickly this can be taken from you. So yeah, conversation to be continued.
Anna, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, I'm looking at the question and answers and seeing then this question by Patricia Marcos about can activism and public memory contestations be seen as a form of reparation and restitution? And I would say that this activism is part of the fight for symbolic reparations. But at the same time, I would say that it's a continuous fight. Then that it is a fight that will never be fully achieved, because all these battles for the monuments and the construction of memorials and museums, and including this history in the public narrative, all this is about not what happened in the past, but what is happening in the present. Then the addition, the change of this, of the creation of new monuments or the removal of these monuments will provide one more step towards this dialogue, or even this battle to see who is going to occupy the public space, but it's not going to provide a solution. And one of the elements that led me to write the previous book on the financial reparations of 2017 was exactly because of that, because I have been working on these monuments and memorials, and these are all symbolic reparations that have been largely accepted over the last years, even by the states. Then in France, there will be a memorial, then in Paris, all these initiatives, we have national days of commemorations. But when we speak about providing financial resources to the descendants of the populations who were enslaved or colonized, then the conversation ends. Then this is the problem of the symbolic and financial reparations, this sort of combination that that does not really provide does not provide a solution, but is rather an expression of the inequalities that still persist. And I would say that one of the places that I would say that is very interesting, because it's Patricia that is asking, is Portugal, is in a city like Lisbon, where now there will be a memorial to the victims of the Atlantic slave trade, is a city that we are talking about that memorial, and at the same time there are other groups fighting to have a museum of the great discoveries of Portugal that would be placed not far from the memorial that is planned to be created.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try and group a couple more questions here. There are a number of different questions about education, about centralized education, about whether, again, coming back to this question of memorials and plaques that focus on enslavers, could activists or have activists instead focused on education about the enslaved, for instance? So that's a question from Laurel Semley, but it also dovetails with a number of questions about centralized education, perhaps decentralized education in the United States, and maybe connected to this, if we want to bring France back into the story, whether there's any political party in France. You mentioned Macron earlier, but whether there's any political party in France that's willing to take this on, or whether we are, mostly looking at kind of civil society activism. How about Mom to start?
You want to go? So, and I know that we talked a lot about monuments, but I mean, when thinking about the memorialization of slavery and the history of race in France, one thing that is also extremely important is the signs of this memory in everyday life, in everyday product. And I just saw Jean mentioning the banana products, the way race is just permeating, and the way slavery and you know, momentum coming from slavery are permeating daily aspects of our lives. But, and this is where I thought that the reaction that we got from people looking at the fresco from the Assemblée Nationale and asking me, but what is wrong with it? It's beautiful. It's, you know, it's commemorating the abolition of slavery. The fact, how were we able to lose the link between the sign, what the sign meant, and what the fact that it doesn't echo, right? It doesn't ping for people in 2020. And this is where education really plays a huge part. But again, as Francesca mentioned and Jean mentioned, and we know, education is extremely centralized in France, top down. And right now, most of the efforts that are undertaken by these activist groups, these social actors, and like I say, it's a really healthy mix of activists, artists, scholars, are really frowned upon because it's just seen as importing Anglo-Saxon American perspective on race and racism in France. It's seen as rewriting French history. And again, this is something that I heard when I was told by Catherine Millet that I should be happy and proud that my history, the history of slavery, was featured in one of the most important buildings in France. My history, like the slave, you know, were just born in Africa, and they decided to transport themselves and, you know, pick cotton in the West Indies. So just this idea again, where did we miss it in our education? How come people cannot see this as a history of France, but it's seen as an outside history, right? Either the history of the descendant of this of the slave trade, or history of America or Brazil that people are trying to force in our beautiful Republican narrative. So I think of it as the flaws of our education system. Some of my colleagues, and Julian is one, think that it's where actually the Republican narrative succeeded. And when you think of it, this tension between, is it a flaw? Can it be corrected? Or is it, you know, what the plan was from the beginning to create this beautiful narrative à la Renan that will, you know, highlight the success and this beautiful roman national. This is where the tension are, and that's where we'll be working, you know, trying to push the rope toward our side.
It's so interesting to hear you just invoke Renan, because of course he says that history is dangerous for the nation, right?
Yeah,
he has a particular idea of what history can do. And I think that's, you know, the Republican impulse right now is sensing that danger. But what you're saying is actually history is necessary. If there's going to be a vivre ensemble, a living together with this legacy.
Absolutely. I mean, Renan is the one who said that the community is made by a group of people who had done amazing things together in the past, and who from that takes the energy to do more great things in the future. But when people look at me and ask me where I'm from, and they have no idea that, you know, I'm from Senegal, and Senegal entered in the French Empire in 1659, that my family had been French since 1835. This ability to look at me and see me part of this group, because I mean, my history, right, my past, what made me part of this group had been patiently excised from our common history. I mean, I think this is where the crux of the matter for us right now, to make sure that we are not rewriting, we are not, you know, canceling, we are not creating, but we're just trying to unveil it.
Right. And I mean, I'm struck by, I want to turn to Anna to answer that same question in a second, but I'm struck by some additional comments here in the chat. Again, a fair amount of skepticism about whether plaques, you know, can solve our problem, and is graffiti an answer? You know, is that a talking back? And could we leave? I mean, if I'm understanding Philippe Robichaud's comment entirely, can we maybe allow that that talking back to be present rather than cleaning it? I'm speaking for him a bit, but that's how I'm interpreting his question, an ethical kind of forgetting or rememorializing. And then there are questions too, simply factual questions that, you know, people want to hear they want the links to all the different associations you mentioned, all the different organizations and monuments and so forth. So I don't know if we can totally reconstruct that. This has been recorded and it will be placed up on the web next week. So you can certainly listen again. And to the extent that we can provide some links with that, we will certainly try to do that. Other questions from Sabrina Jahed, for instance, are there still monuments to colonizers in France? So the questions run, the whole gamut, and unfortunately, we're not going to have time to answer all of them, but I'd like to give Anna a chance to answer about education, and then maybe we can have some concluding remarks.
Yeah, I would say that the issue of education is not opposed to the question of memorials. Of course, that the opposition here that I see behind these questions is the idea of history and memory. And France is one of these countries that really embraces this, the concept of memory as something that appears even in the commemoration dates. But when we had the law in France, the Taubira law, there was the idea of looking at the textbooks and also to promote the education. For example, museums are also institutions that are intended to provide education to the population. Now, this is not opposed to the issue of the monuments. And at the same time, we cannot maintain monuments to white supremacy outside as it exists here in the United States, and on the other hand, claim to write textbooks that will be accurate. This said, of course, that in a country where there is more, where education is more centralized, perhaps it is possible to do projects of this kind that will be successful. One example that I could give is the case of Brazil, where there is a law that passed in 2003 that is in place that makes mandatory the teaching of Afro-Brazilian history and culture in the school curricula and the university as well. Does this change the context of racism with a president that is clearly a white supremacist that we have now in Brazil? It doesn't. Then I do not believe that only these official measures can clean up and solve the problem of racism, that at the end of the day, this is why what you are talking about when you are referring to the issue of monuments. And then we have this question by Philippe Robichaud that I see that he's saying, if we could not leave all this there as it was, perhaps in France will be the case. Then people, they are intervening on these monuments. We have other places where these interventions have been there, the case of Robert Milligan and Colston in England. But there is a moment that it's not going to be us who will decide if the monuments should stay or should go, as it happened here in the United States. Then at some point, the interventions, there is a limit to this. And this, perhaps in some places, it works to have these constant interventions, but in other contexts, perhaps where things are more polarized, perhaps it doesn't necessarily work.
I think coming to that question of limitations maybe leads us to the very last question, because some of the questions point in that direction as well. Already mentioned the limitations of plaques, but the limitations of what museums are willing to take in. The question of whether you would create another kind of memory space like Memento Park, which of course the Memento Park that you referred to was directed at a foreign entity, Soviet communism. This is a point made by Burt Gordon. So can you have an analogous type of institution, especially as Dan Sherman points out, museums don't necessarily want this material. So I suppose if there's any last remarks on that front, we'll close with that. And once again, we'll have a video up next week. It will be closed captioned, so it takes a few days for that to come out. We'll do our best to provide other information that came out in this webinar. So I'll just turn it over one more time to Mom and Anna for last remarks, and thank all of you for coming.
You want to go, Anna?
Go ahead.
Well, where will these things go? We need a conversation. We need a conversation on that. Museums are at the height of the fresco scandal. We were asked, where do you think that this fresco should go? And most of the the militants or younger scholars that I was talking to told me, I don't want this thing to go anywhere. It needs to be destroyed. And in my opinion, and like I said, it should not be destroyed. This is a testament. I mean, when you look at the piece, it's huge. It's 40 feet long, and you just have all these questions. This was created in 1991. How did it get? Was it created? What went through the artist's brain when he created that? How was it hauled into a truck, delivered to the National Assembly? What went through these guys' brain when they unloaded from the truck? And it went there for 30 years. And so for me, and this is exactly what Anna was saying, it says as much about our time that it says about France in 1991 and what happened during the 30 years. It's a testament of 30 years of our history. So to destroy it because it's an eyesore, no. So we will need a conversation, and this conversation sometimes it's hard for it to happen because people are bothered by emotion, and in the emotions of the crowd, things are destroyed, things are moved, but we need to have this conversation. And right now in France, it's hard because to touch on this subject is to touch the Republic. And this is where we are. We are the déboulonneurs de the Republic, because we are going against this carefully crafted narrative. And like I said, for the third time tonight, l'histoire a continué to be continued.
I love the idea of doing a history of the putting up of that mural. What the artist was thinking. Anna Popiel asks us in the chat about what was the artist, thinking.
I'm writing a short piece about that. It's fascinating. I'm writing a short piece about, it's absolutely fascinating.
Then maybe, a history or an anthropology of the people who were involved with it, the people who have visited it. That would be, it would be hard to do, but it would be really fascinating. Okay, Anna, last thoughts.
Yeah, I think that this kind of work can be done with different monuments and memorials that we know in different countries. And I think that there is no single answer. I know that people, they are anxious to have an answer that is going to work for all these contexts. And we do not have an answer that is going to work in one single city. Then perhaps in a neighborhood is going to work and elsewhere is not going to work. The communities at the end of the day, they have the right to decide to keep these monuments if they are consulted. In many cases, we know that nobody was asked if they wanted. Do you think that any Black citizen in Paris was asked if they wanted to see that mural at the National Assembly? Not at all. In addition to that, that piece in particular is aesthetically speaking horrible. Then even the artistic value of that thing is something that we could question and could justify throwing that and burning that and forgetting that it was ever executed. But I think that this is the element, perhaps in some places having these memento parks, in other places perhaps they go to the museum, like Colston, even with the graffiti that was painted on him. This is going to be displayed in one of the museums in Bristol. In other places, people, they don't want to see that anymore, or at least they don't want to see these statues perhaps in the next 10 years, but perhaps in 10 years from now, they would like to see it. And one element very important that Mama, she mentioned is to see when these monuments were constructed, because there is no single timeline, unlike perhaps the Confederate monuments in the United States, and even there we can ask ourselves, for example, monument of Milligan was put there when slavery still existed, early 19th century, Colston, end of the 19th century. And there is one monument that has been contested in Portugal. There is the monument of the Jesuit priest, Padre Vieira, that was a man who essentially supported slavery, and then he was active in Brazil. That monument was put there in 2017 in a moment that was really that it was opposing all these the presence of Black groups who were claiming indeed that the memory of slavery should be highlighted and not the memory of the slave traders. Then all these monuments, they needed to be dealt, I would say, individually, even if it is a painful task. Thank you, Mary, for having us.
Oh, well, thank you. This was fascinating. And as you can see from the Q&A, it really elicited a lot of really wonderful reactions. And I'm sorry that we couldn't get to everyone's question at all and do justice to it, but I hope that we've at least, started to answer those wonderful questions, and that you will all come back for more events at the Center for European Studies. I think it's particularly important for a Center of European Studies to do this kind of event where we acknowledge that, Europe is not just a white space, but is made up of a great diversity of people and a history that was engaged with the slave trade and enslavement. So that's important to me ethically, and I'm glad to see that it elicited so much interest. I thank all of you for your wonderful questions, and especially our presenters, Professor Araujo, and Professor Nyang, for their wonderful contributions. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup, Marie.
Merci, Marie, ma'am. Thank you.